everyone. My name is Dominic Chitis, and today my IPP will be in regard to the limited liability companies. Today we're going to talk about some elements regarding LLCs, limited liability companies. We'll start with what an LLC is. We'll then go on to LLC issues and the legalities involved. Then we'll talk about limited personal liability, taxes, operating agreements, and an example of New Mexico Secretary of State Articles of Organization, and piercing the corporate veil, and how ethics play as a factor in being protected by the legal structure of an LLC. Limited liability companies, also known as LLCs, are legal business structures allowed by state government statutes. Owners of an LLC are called members. An interesting fact is that most states do not restrict ownership, meaning that individuals or even other business entities and related can be members. There's not a cap on member counts, and most states allows single member LLCs or one owner LLC. There are restrictions on types of businesses that cannot be LLCs, such as financial institutions and insurance companies. The majority of people starting a business have probably considered forming a limited liability company if they are concerned about losing their personal assets because of the type of business. According to the legal advice website FindLaw, companies most suited for LLCs are those that are engaged in dangerous business, that are likely to experience lawsuits, and those that are likely to owe a great deal of money. Now, let's go ahead and look at some LLC legal issues. First one is the liability issues. We're going to talk about limited personal liability and what that entails. Personal assets versus business assets. For example, when there's a company who is filed suit against, there are cases where, because of the LLC structure, personal assets are protected, and the only assets that can be exhausted in the suit would be those of the business. Next to the liability issues is how negligence eliminates the LLC's protections, and we'll talk about that as we move along in this presentation. Next, we'll focus on tax issues. Tax issues are usually a big concern for business owners, and in staying in compliance with taxes, and if you don't, there can be a big federal or state law backlash for those individuals operating the LLC. Currently, there are no federal tax classifications for LLCs in the IRS. There are different rules in different states, along with additional tax rules for LLCs in different states. Next, we'll discuss the operating agreement issues, such as the state not necessarily requiring an operating agreement to be filed in the state it does business with. Understanding that an operating agreement is a legally binding document, and those issues within an operating agreement state different members, percentage of ownership, the pay, buyout options, and legal ethical issues. And finally, we'll discuss different state issues, such as different laws that affect an LLC, LLC operation in multiple states, and how there's legal issues based on different state laws. And usually states oversee member caps management limitations, and company type limitations. Like shareholders of a corporation, all LLC owners are protected from personal liability for business debts and claims. This means that if the business itself can pay a creditor or cannot pay a creditor, such as a supplier, a lender, or a landlord, the creditor cannot legally come after an LLC member's personal assets, like their house, car, or other personal goods. LLC assets are used to pay off business debts. LLC owners stand to lose only the money they have invested in the LLC. This feature is often called limited liability. Next are the tax issues. So there is a very distinct difference between corporations versus LLCs. Corporations are taxed as a separate entity. Hence, the term that comes with it is double taxation, since there are terms aligned with corporate tax. LLC profits and losses pass through to each member. That's where we see the term pass through is very important in this case for an LLC, where there is no double taxation. There are times when the IRS will automatically classify a business that is limited or restricted from becoming an LLC. And in this case, it's usually banks or insurance companies. There are differences between single-member LLCs and multi-member LLCs. Just a little bit of information of which forms they file on their individual tax forms. For example, the single-member LLC files Schedule C, and members or owners report all profits and losses on personal income tax returns. And that form is usually attached to their 1040-A. Multi-members are all still responsible for their taxes, and they are known to the IRS as partnerships. One thing I didn't mention about single-member LLCs is they are classified by the IRS as sole proprietorships. So you can already see the confusion involved with the IRS not having a classification for LLCs in general for the federal government. Back to multi-member LLC, partners or all partners are to file a Form 1065, which all partners report income. And attached to that as well is the Schedule K1, where each member reports share of partnership income, credits, and deductions. Finally, we will talk about state taxes. State taxes are very complex for LLCs, as for every state has different tax laws. Some taxes have sales tax and some don't. For example, New Mexico has a sales tax rate that changes almost every 6 months, and the state of Texas is not involved with a point of purchase tax. So there can be confusion when an LLC provides services from state to state. As for every state requires different tax claims and filing. Operating agreements are a contract that describes the operation of an LLC that formally sets the understanding and agreement between members of the LLC. As you can see, we are starting to talk about contractual agreements within an LLC. It's legally formed, it is also legally bound. And pertaining to ethics and ethical behavior, we could see how an operating agreement being legally bound is very important for every member to uphold high ethical standards, so the operating agreement isn't breached or broken in any kind of way. In some ways, it is often compared to that of the bylaws of a corporation. An operating agreement is like with any contractual agreement, there are many terms regarding the jargon of a legally binding contract, such as name of the LLC, term, which is also the period or length of time that the LLC will be operating. You must name the registered agent, its purpose, the contributions involved in an LLC, the liabilities of members, and each member can have even more limited liability according to the operating agreement. Managers involved and how much power or decision-making ability a management team or person, individual has. Fiduciary duties, and for example, a fiduciary duty is the highest standard of care. The person who has fiduciary duty is called a fiduciary, and the person to whom he owes the duty is typically referred as a principal or beneficiary. Also involved within a meeting on operating agreement are meetings and the dissolution and termination of an LLC. With each agreement, and we know that each agreement is different, each state may have specific language that is required for operating agreement and operating agreements. And state law requirements may differ, as we had talked about, in sections and language they require for LLC operating agreements. Which also state that operating agreements may or may not hold ethical standards or definitions, but it's always recommended, I would say, to lay down the ethical standards and laws and rules and compliances in an operating agreement, which will then be seen by those members and hopefully practice to create or develop an ethical culture within the organization. Here we have an example of the Articles of Organization for the Secretary of State of New Mexico. If someone wanted to form an LLC in the state of New Mexico, he or she would be required to develop and submit limited liability company Articles of Organization. This document shows the articles from 1 to 6, and this should give you an example and an understanding of the legalities or the legal structure of the Articles of Organization. This pertaining to ethics, it is also very important for the members or organizer to uphold an ethical standard of accurate information involved. One example can be the amount of members, or you're making sure that the members are placed according to members' ownership in the Articles of Organization. Yes, there are times when a member can be removed or replaced, but all that must be followed within the operating agreement. So let's just go through this together. Article 1, of course, is very simple, and this is a very simple legal formation that I believe the Secretary of State has to help those who are interested in forming an LLC. Article 1 states the name of the LLC, Article 2 is the period or duration. Note that the period can have a timestamp, and it could also be perpetual, meaning as long as forever. And Article 3 is, of course, the street address for the registered agent. Registered agent is the individual who is chosen to receive legal documents, not necessarily an owner of the business. This individual can, like I said, be an individual or a business entity. Then you have the name of the registered agent, mailing address of the LLC, and whether or not the LLC will decide to choose a manager to take care of business affairs within the LLC, and how much, according to the operating agreement, how much decision power they have. Article 5 states the limited liability company as a single member or a multi-member. And then finally, we finish up with choosing the effective date of operation for the LLC. Finally, the members will sign and date and then submit the document to the New Mexico Secretary of State. It is also important to note that in filing these documents, the state of New Mexico upholds the standard of honesty and accuracy for our documentation, because it is legally binding. Now we're going to talk about piercing the corporate veil. And this is where ethical behavior plays a huge part in remaining protected by the LLC legal structure. And now that we have a better understanding of what an LLC entails, it's now very important to understand that ethical behavior and intentions are important to sustain the protection of the legal entity. A key reason that business owners and managers choose to form a limited liability company is so that they won't be held personally liable for debts. Should be unable to pay, that they should be unable to pay the creditor. If a court pierces a company's corporate veil, the owners, shareholders, or members of an LLC can be held personally liable for corporate debts. This means that creditors can go after owners' homes, bank accounts, investments, or other assets to satisfy the LLC debt. But courts will impose personal liability only on those individuals who are responsible for the LLC's wrongful or fraudulent actions. They won't hold innocent parties personally liable for a company's debts. So, in essence, piercing the corporate veil is mandated by the courts or the court system. And the court can only do this if the LLC is found in the realm of doing something wrongful or fraudulent or indifferent to the law. In this case, if the LLC is acting unethical, then the courts will may see that probable cause to lift the protections of an LLC, or in this case, pierce the protections of an LLC, and hence pierce the corporate veil and reach over into the personal assets of the business or LLC members. Another thing to remember is if an LLC shuts its doors and closes down during this time, or in a time where there's an unpaid creditor, An unpaid creditor can sue for payment still. It doesn't matter if the LLC is not operating anymore. There's still plenty of time for the creditor to sue for payment. And like I said, the court orders the lift on the LLC's protections. Another reason for courts piercing the corporate veil happens in many cases where there's not an absolute separation between the company and the owner, where maybe the finances or the bank accounts are mixed. There's no discrete difference between where the money is being spent, whether it's personal or for business reasons or purposes. In this case, it's also known as the alter ego liability issue. Another reason is creditors may sue because they suffer an unjust cost, even if the LLC is still operating and there's a lot of money on the table. An LLC may face the piercing of their corporate veil because the creditor has not been paid. And then finally, it is very, very important that an LLC follows their legal formalities. If there's something in the operating agreement that is not being followed, there will be a case where suit can be filed within the organization, and those who did not follow the formalities of the legal document and the operating agreement can be accountable and will be accountable for their actions. Final thoughts are in regard to the intentions, realities, and necessary ethical practices in forming an LLC, the operating and managing an LLC. The initial intentions may be to protect oneself from legal risk that limits personal liability. The realities are that LLCs are complex legal organizations, also known as legal entities, that require compliance and ethical action regarding laws, taxes, and operating agreement. Finally, ethical practices are vital to the continual protection that an LLC provides to prevent the piercing of the corporate veil. I'd like to thank everybody for their time and listening to this presentation. And I would like to also wish everybody a great day. Thank you very much, and have a good one.